In today's message, we're going to learn three things. We're going to see the temple rebuilt, we're going to see the two witnesses, and we're going to see the trumpet sound. That's the three things we're going to see in this passage today. The temple rebuilt, the two witnesses, and the trumpet sound. So I just want us to kind of jump right in and say that God has always had, throughout the ages, he's always had his prophets down through the ages to proclaim his message. And in the midst of the tribulation, he will still have his prophets. He will have his preachers. In the tribulation, he's going to raise up specifically two witnesses. And these guys, that's what they are. They're preachers. He's going to raise up two preachers, two prophets, who will proclaim the gospel of the kingdom for that last 3.5 year period of time. Right? So in that last 3.5 years, that's in the midst of the most troubling time, in the midst of the trumpet judgments, right? Christ is going to do all that he can to bring Israel back to him. And we saw a little bit of that last week. And just to let you know, this still falls in the book of Revelation. This still falls in the midst of that interval we talked about between the trumpets and the vials. Between all of those judgments, between the seals and the trumpets, there was an interval to tell you about the 144,000 that would be witnessing. And now between the trumpets and the vials, we have another interval where he talks about how Christ will reveal himself to Israel, and he talks about his two witnesses in the temple in this chapter. And then in chapter 12, he's going to kind of start the story all over again. We saw last week that he's going to reveal himself to Israel just like Joseph, right, revealed himself at the end of the book of Genesis to the 12 tribes of Israel. We saw a wonderful picture there that he revealed himself to the tribes who rejected him, and he forgave them, and they were reconciled. And that shows us not only a beautiful picture of forgiveness within the personal relationships, but it shows us a prophetic picture of what Christ is going to do to Israel in the end. And so that's what we saw last week. And so added to that, he's going to raise up these two preachers to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel, their gospel preaching, along with the 144,000 Apostle Pauls that we saw back in chapter 7. They will bring salvation to the believing remnant of Israel. These two preacher prophets will proclaim the gospel of the kingdom, which is a little bit different than the gospel of Paul, right? It's a little bit different than the gospel of Paul. They're going to be preaching the blood of Jesus Christ, but their primary message is that the king is coming, right? The king is getting ready to come back and set up his kingdom. And that's the primary thrust of their message, along with the blood of Christ. Paul wasn't preaching that the king is getting ready to come. He was preaching the cross. You need to believe in the cross, because the next thing on the timeline for the church is we're going to leave. The next thing on the timeline for these guys is that the king is going to come. The last trump is going to sound. There's going to be earthquakes and lightnings and voices out of heaven and great vials poured on the earth. Very different what's coming up next for them than what's coming up next for us. And so they're going to be preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and they will proclaim not only the gospel of the kingdom, but they will be proclaiming judgment upon the unrighteousness of Satan's kingdom that is ruling on the earth at this time. Their ministry, as we're going to see here in chapter 11, will lead right up to the end when that seventh trumpet blows. So they, along with the 144,000 preachers, will fulfill what Christ taught us in Matthew 24, verse 14. Take a look at that verse. Matthew 24, verse 14. It says, and this gospel of the kingdom. Do you see that? You got to make that distinction. So that helps you to place it where it's at in our eschatological timeline. For this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then what? And then the end shall come, right? So you have a lot of people that get their eschatology wrong. They think that whenever we preach the gospel that we're preaching today to everyone in the world, then that's when the end will come. But that's not what it's saying. It's saying that in the time of tribulation, whenever they preach their gospel of the kingdom to all of the nations, then the end will come after that. So it kind of gives you a better understanding of your timeline. But there is something that God reveals to us or introduces to us before he really gets into these two witnesses. Before he gets to those two witnesses, he introduces something to us that's very important, and that is the temple. You see this in verse number 1. He says, "And there was given to me a reed like a rod." Now this was a special kind of reed or rod that was kind of hollow inside, but it was pretty sturdy, and it was typical for them to use this as like a measuring stick. When I was a kid, every teacher in our classroom had like a yardstick, and they would have that like in the corner. It's like 3 foot made up a yard, and they would use that, to beat unruly children, right? That's what they would use. Not really. Sometimes, but not really. We could do that back then. It was considered okay. But they had this rod, like a reed, and the angel stood and said, "Rise and measure the temple." Measure the temple, he says, and the altar, and them that worship therein. So he says 3 things. Measure the temple, the altar, and the worshipers. Measuring out 3 different things there. But the court, which is without the temple, he says, leave that out, right? Measure it not. For that is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months, 3.5 years, right? The Gentiles are going to tread all over this city for 3.5 years. So John sees the temple of God, and it's located in the holy city, which is what? Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is where it says that it will be trodden under the foot of the Gentiles for 3.5 years. So we know this is not the temple in heaven that he's talking about. He's talking about the temple that is on the earth in Jerusalem. Now, can anyone think of a problem with that? that does pose quite a problem, doesn't it? John sees a temple in Jerusalem on the earth that will be trodden under the Gentiles for 3.5. The city will be trodden under the Gentiles for 3.5 years, and that is a real problem because John is writing this in about 90 A.D. when he's writing this letter, and guess what happened about 20 years before he ever set pen to paper? 20 years before he ever wrote this letter, the temple was completely destroyed in Jerusalem, right? By Titus in Rome, they came and they sacked all of Jerusalem and they burnt the temple to the ground. So there is no temple when John writes this. That's weird, isn't it? So when he's transported to the day of the Lord, what does he see standing in Jerusalem? The temple. That's crazy. That would be very significant for John. You can imagine how his heart must have leapt when he got to the future, when the Lord takes him and the Spirit shows him the day of the Lord, and he sees that the temple is standing in Jerusalem. The Lord is showing him this future vision, and in this future vision, the temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt. The temple is there again. So that means that the temple is going to be rebuilt at some point. And that is the significance of measuring it, right? That's the significance of measuring it. That's the first thing that you do when you rebuild something, right? I used to do construction, if you can imagine. So basically, they would just tell me to stand there, and they wouldn't let me touch any of the tools, right? Because I can't build anything. But my dad got me the job when I was a teenager, and he made me go. I didn't want to go, and I even told them that. I don't want to be here, man, any more than you want me to be here, right? And so I would stand there, but I would watch them, and that's what they would do, man. They'd grab their big tape measure, and they'd pull it out, and they'd measure on the floor, and they were measuring up, the walls and all this stuff, and they're marking things and putting chalk down, and before you know it, there was walls up, and they would measure it out. That's what John is doing here. He's measuring it all out because the temple is going to be rebuilt in the future. Currently in Israel, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but currently in Israel, you have people that's their plans right now. They currently have plans to rebuild the temple. There's at least 3 different groups that I know of. You have the Temple Institute. You also have an institute a gathering that's called the Temple Mount. You also have Eretz Israel Faithful Movement. All 3 of them state very plainly that their goal is to rebuild the temple in Israel. But this is a problem, isn't it? Because on the temple site in Jerusalem there are 2 mosques there. One, the most popular, the Dome of the Rock, is placed there, and it's right on the temple site. And so that's the most obvious obstacle to rebuilding that. But besides that obvious obstacle of these two Muslim mosques that are currently inhabiting the site in Jerusalem, do you want to know what the primary obstacle is? Besides that, well, that's big. That's a huge obstacle. But besides that, even if you were to take those two Muslim mosques away from the site and the site was free, do you want to know why that they would still be unable to build? One of the primary, this really struck me, I could not believe this when I read this. One of the primary obstacles to rebuilding the temple are the measurements. They don't know the right measurements because the measurements given in the scriptures are given in cubits. And this brings a lot of questions and doubts, not only to the correct size of the temple and the altar specifically, but also to the location, the exact location of the site, right? And so the Talmud itself recounts the building of the temple that we saw under under Ezra and Zerubbabel, and then later Nehemiah came and rebuilt the walls. And they recount the second temple that was built, and they said in the Talmud that the only reason why that it was able to be rebuilt is because it was under prophetic guidance under Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And we touched on that whenever we went through the book of Ezra, how these prophets came. Remember, they were just sitting there doing nothing. And then all of a sudden, Haggai and Zechariah come along and they're like, you guys need to rebuild the temple. And it was under the direct guidance of these prophets that the temple was able to be rebuilt. Now, so they look at that today as they want to rebuild the temple, and they claim that without proper prophetic guidance, it would be impossible to rebuild the temple even if the mosques were no longer on the site. They would need the prophets of God to tell them, here's where you need to build it, here's what a cubit actually is, because there's disagreement as to exactly how long a cubit is today. And so here's where the site is, here's the measurements, and it would be under God's divine prophetic guidance that the temple would be able to be rebuilt. I'm not saying that's true or false. I'm saying that's what they believe. That's what they believe, is that that's the only way the temple is going to be built, which I think is particularly interesting because when you come to chapter 11 in Revelation, what two things do you find? You find, first of all, John is measuring the temple, and right after he measures the temple, what does God reveal? Two prophets that are going to come to be his preachers. He gives you measurements and prophets that are going to come in the time of tribulation. You see a temple, you see measurements, and you see prophets. Now, I'm not trying to say that they are going to be the ones who guide in the building of the temple, but I do think it's interesting that they're saying those are the two things that they need in order to rebuild today. That's what they're saying. And when we read Revelation chapter 11, those are the two things that God gives them. He shows them the temple, he's measuring it out, and he gives them two prophets in order to guide them. So I think that that's really cool. Could it be that like Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, that these two prophets will cause the people to rebuild? We cannot be sure. The passage doesn't tell us. All we know is that the people in Israel right now say that they need measurements and that they need prophetic guidance to rebuild. So there are, as you might expect, when you look in the Bible, there are 7 temples that you find in the Bible. Did you guys know that? There are actually 7 temples, and that's no surprise. As we see in Revelation, there's like 7 of everything, right? Always 7. That's God's complete number. So let me just show you these temples. First, you have kind of the first temple, if you can call it that, is the tabernacle in the wilderness. And these are the places where God chooses to put his name, where God comes down and actually meets with man. The tabernacle in the wilderness, and then after that, the first permanent non-moving temple was Solomon's temple. That's temple number 2, really. And then number 3 would be the one we talked about that you see in Ezra that was built under the guidance of Zerubbabel. He built the second temple after the exile. Number 4 is that during the time of Christ, you saw Herod rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, right? There was a temple then. And you see that as you read the Gospels and as you read the book of Acts, the temple is there in existence. That was Herod's temple, which was also quite massive, but not quite as big as Solomon's. Right now, though, okay, obviously the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There was no more temple, but right now the Bible tells us, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, that we are the temple, right? We are the temple. We're the place where God has chosen to put his name. The Holy Spirit has indwelled us, and that we do not worship necessarily in a temple made with bricks and wood, but we are the temple today. In number 6, the temple will be rebuilt, according to Matthew 24:15, in the time of the tribulation. And we know, according to Ezekiel, Haggai, and Zechariah, that another temple will be rebuilt by Christ during the millennial kingdom. That will be kind of the 7th and final temple, will be one built by Christ in the millennial kingdom. When we look past that time into eternity future, the Bible tells us in Revelation chapter 21, verse 22, it says that there is no temple because the Lord our God and his Son and the Lamb, it says that they are the temple. They are the temple, which I think is cool because in some ways, because it says they are the temple, that's kind of like the 8th temple, if you will, which if you look at your biblical numerology, 8 always stands for new beginnings. Right? And that's when he makes everything new. He makes a new heaven and a new earth. And we have the new Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven. And we have a fresh, brand new start. And of course, this is the temple that was always meant to be, is God himself with his Son is the temple. So I think maybe that you could count that as an 8th temple where we have that new beginning. It's very possible that in the first part, the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, you remember that we said the Antichrist, when he comes on the scene, he's going to come on in with peace, right? He's going to have all the flattery and all the nice words. He's going to fix all the problems. Everyone's going to think he's a great guy. And he's going to make a treaty. He's going to make a covenant with many nations, including the nation of Israel. And I believe, it's speculation on my part, but I believe this will be the time that the building of the temple in the tribulation will happen. Right now, the political scene, if you can imagine, if they tried to make a move on the temple site right now, it would cause World War III. I mean, it would just be a disaster. But whenever the Antichrist comes in and he brings this false peace, and at that time he's kind of pretending to be a friend to Israel, I think it's very possible that the political scene will be such that the temple could be rebuilt during that time, in the very beginning of the tribulation. So what we're seeing here in Revelation chapter 11 is that the temple in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, the temple will be rebuilt. However, we know from Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians that the Antichrist is going to, at the midway point in the tribulation, he's going to turn on the Jews. At that point, he's going to really reveal himself for who he really is, and he's going to claim that he is himself God. He's going to say that he is Christ. And what he's going to do at that time, according to these passages, as we've already looked at, he's going to make all of their sacrificial system that they're observing in this new temple, he's going to make all of it to cease. And he's going to desecrate their temple. And he's going to claim that he is the only one that can be worshiped as God during that time. That's when he's going to turn on Israel, the believing Israel, and begin to really pursue them, because they're not going to worship him. And he's going to start to pursue them in order to wipe them out. So measuring off the temple here in these first couple of verses, it really symbolizes not only the rebuilding of the temple, but he's also measuring off the worshipers, it says. He's measuring off that remnant that will be saved during the time of tribulation. I want you to look at the words of Zechariah. Look at the words of Zechariah, chapter 13, verses 8 through 9. This is remarkable what Zechariah says. And it says, "And it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die. But the 3rd part shall be left therein." He's always going to have his remnant of believing. He says, "And I will bring the 3rd part through the fire, And I will refine them as silver is refined, and I will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people. And they shall say, the Lord is my God. That's going to happen. What he's predicting there, that's going to happen. He said, there's going to be a time I'm going to refine the nation of Israel, and 2/3 part are not going to believe, but there's going to be a remnant. He says, and I will bring them through the fire in order to purify them. But there will be that third part that he will say to them, you are my people, and they will say back to me that the Lord is my God. That is going to happen at this time. As we mentioned, the way that he will bring the believing remnant back to him is through his preachers, who are his 144,000 preachers, those 144,000 Apostle Pauls that are going to go out. They're going to be led by these two main prophets, by these two main preachers. So I want us to take a look at the two witnesses. So we know the temple is going to be rebuilt at some point. I believe it's probably going to start once the Antichrist comes on the scene and he brings peace in the Middle East. And I think he's going to allow the temple to be rebuilt. I'm not saying I know for sure the timing of it. All I can say for sure is that sometime during that time, it is going to be rebuilt. But now I want us to take a look at these two witnesses that we see. And this really covers verses 3 through 13. It says, and I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days. That's 3.5 years. And they're going to be clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. Man, wouldn't that be great to have on the high street when we're preaching the gospel? Someone's like, man, I think you're stupid because you believe in Jesus. And you're like, oh, really? That's interesting. And then you just shoot fire out of your mouth and devour your enemies. Actually, that wouldn't be very cool, would it? That wouldn't be very good at all. No, we want them to get saved. We want them to go to heaven. But this is a time of judgment, so it's very different. And I'm also not a prophet. So they have this fire that comes out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have the power to shut up heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have the power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues, as often as they will. And when they shall have finished their testimony, when the time of their preaching is done, the beast that sitteth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies, this is what is remarkable. I think this is remarkable what happens. Their dead bodies just lie in the street. The people say, we're not even going to respect them enough to give them burial. They're not even going to bury them. Their bodies are just going to lie in the street of the great city. Now, what city is this? Which spiritually is called Sodom in Egypt, right? So it's a wicked city, right? Spiritually, it's a wicked city. Now, we do know that, right? We talked about that, how we could have trouble with the nation of Israel being God's chosen people because they've rejected the gospel, haven't they? We don't necessarily agree with everything that they believe and what they've done, but we just know where they're headed. We know God will save them eventually, but they've turned their back on God in many ways, and many of them, as we learned from Zechariah, 2/3 of them won't even believe. And so spiritually have turned away from God, and spiritually it's called Sodom. We certainly, when we look at Israel today, we know spiritually it's not right. It's not right with God. It's spiritually Sodom and Egypt. Both in the Bible are pictures of the world. They're very worldly, not spiritual. This was the city, it says, where also our Lord was crucified. So we know what city he's talking about. He's talking about in Jerusalem. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues of all nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. And they that dwell upon the earth, they're going to throw a party. And they're going to make merry. It's going to be like Christmas to them. They're going to send gifts to each other. I wonder if they're gonna have like, you go to Clinton's or some sort of card shop or something like, are they gonna have like dead prophet wrapping paper or something like, what are they gonna have special cards and trinkets that you can send to each other? I don't know what they're gonna do, but they're gonna have like this huge celebration. They're gonna be so relieved that these guys are dead, that they're gonna throw a party and they're gonna bring gifts for one another in order to commemorate this wonderful event. They're going to be so excited that they're not preaching anymore. It says, and after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of the life from God entereth into them, and they stood on their feet. And this is going to bring a screeching halt to the party. Okay, the party, you ever seen that in the movies whenever something happens and you can hear the record screech and it goes silent? That's going to happen like all over the world. Everything is just going to go silent, and great fear is going to fall on them when they see that these guys are alive again. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying, come up hither. And they ascended up into heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. In the same hour, as a result of them leaving, there's going to be a great earthquake. A 10th part of the city is going to fall, and the earthquake will slay 7,000. And the remnant will be affrighted, and they'll give glory to God, to the God of heaven. So a couple of things that we can learn about these two witnesses that we just saw through here. We can see that, number one, they're empowered by Christ, right? They are empowered directly by Christ. They're going to preach for 3.5 years. They're going to wear sackcloth, these are clothes of mourning, right? Mourning, because this is going to be a time where they're going to be proclaiming not only the gospel of the kingdom to the believing Israel, but they're going to be proclaiming judgment upon the unrighteousness of man. So they're going to be wearing sackcloth. And these guys are the 2 olive trees, which we'll talk about in just a second, the 2 candlesticks that stand before God. Fire is going to come out of their mouth. They can stop the rain. They can turn water into blood. They can smite the earth with plagues. They'll be killed by the Antichrist. They will rise again, and they will be raptured out at the end. Those are the things that we know. And again, that's not speculation. I just took that directly from the passage. This is going to happen. So, question being, who are these guys? Who are these 2 witnesses? It says here in the passage that they are olive trees. And that comes from Zechariah chapter 4. And we see it in 2 parts, verses 1 to 3 and in verses 11 through 13. So just take a look there. Zechariah chapter 4. Give you a chance to turn over there. It says, and the angel that talked with me came again and waked me, as a man that waketh out of his sleep. And he said unto me, what seest thou? And I said, I have looked, and behold, a candlestick of all gold, and a bowl on top of it, and 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps, which are upon the top thereof. He says, and there's 2 olive trees by it, upon the right side of the bowl, and the other on the left side thereof. Now, just skip down to verse 11. It says, and I answered, and I said unto him, what are these 2 olive trees on the right side of the candlestick, and upon the left side thereof? And I answered again and said unto him, what be these 2 olive branches that through the 2 golden pipes empty the golden oil out of themselves? And he answered me and said, knowest thou not what these be? And I said, no, my Lord. And he said, these are the 2 anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth. That's what he says. These are my 2 anointed ones that stand by the Lord. Just think about that. That's like, it's a pretty honorable position. They're there to stand before the Lord, and they are special. They're the only 2 that have these positions. And they stand before the Lord their God. That's exactly how it describes them in Revelation. We see these 2 witnesses are the 2 olive trees that he's talking about in Zechariah, that he sees in his vision. These 2 guys, these 2 prophets that stand before the Lord, right? Before the Lord of all the earth, it calls them in Revelation. That's exactly who he's talking about here. So who are these 2 olive trees? That's what it calls them. Who are these two trees like men that stand before the Lord that are the anointed ones? Well, I believe the first one that you could say very clearly is Elijah. One of them is Elijah. It tells us very clearly that these guys have the power to stop the rain, right? And we know that's exactly what Elijah had the power to do in the Bible during the time of Ahab. Remember, he prayed and he stopped it from raining, right, for 3.5 years. That's an interesting number, isn't it? How long did he stop it from raining? 3.5 years. How long is he going to be preaching here? 3.5 years. In Luke chapter 4, verse 25, it says, "But I tell you the truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elias," which is another rendering of the name Elijah. That's the same name. "When the heaven was shut up for 3.5 and 6 months. The other one, I believe, is Moses. It says that they will also have the power to turn the water into blood, right? They have the power to turn water into blood, which is exactly what the power that Moses had. Not only that, but it says they have the power to smite the earth with plagues. And when you look at Psalm chapter 105, verses 26 to 36, it says, "He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, which he had chosen, and they showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham, and sent darkness and made it dark, and they rebelled not against his word. And he turned their waters into blood and slew their fish. Their land brought forth frogs." There's those frogs, man. "In the chambers of their kings. And he spake, and there came all diverse sorts of flies and lice and hail and rain and flaming fire in the land, smote their vines and the figs and the trees and the coasts, and the locusts and the caterpillars without number, and did eat up the herbs of the land, devoured the fruit of the ground. He smote the firstborn of their land. He smote the earth with plagues, along with turning the water into blood." And so I think it's pretty clear that these two are probably Moses and Elijah. But there's a couple other reasons why I think that it's Moses and Elijah. For one thing, nobody ever found Moses' body. Whenever Moses died, no one ever found his body. You can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 5 and 6. It says, So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him." So the Lord is the one who buried him. "And he buried him in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day." No one knows where Moses was buried except the Lord. Which is really interesting because in Jude, well, there's only one chapter. In verse 9 of Jude, whenever Satan and Michael the archangel are having a fight with each other, what are they fighting over? It says, "Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses." They were fighting over who's going to get Moses' body, right? Now, why would they fight over that? Now, no man knows where he is, and God, the Lord, is the one who buried him, and the devil really wants his body. Now, this is another reason, I think this is another reason why you can see very clearly this stuff that we're seeing happening in the book of Revelation, these are not just pictures and symbols. This is really happening, right? When the devil and Michael are fighting over Moses' body, that's not a picture of some deeper spiritual truth. They were really fighting over Moses' real body. Now, there's a lot of people, when they read the book of Revelation, they think it's all just like a big picture of what us as Christians go through every day, right? It's just symbolic of the overall victory of Christ and the tribulations that Christians go through every day. But when you start to dig into what the prophets teach, what actually happened, right, to Moses and to these different people, with Elijah the same way, when you start to look at what it talks about in the New Testament, like in the book of Jude, when you start to compare that to what you're actually reading in the book of Revelation, there's no question that this is literal. This is really happening. And so they were fighting over the body of Moses, and I believe the reason why they were fighting over his body is because the Lord still had plans for his body. I don't think the Lord was done with Moses. Not only did Moses, was he buried in a special place, and the Lord still had plans for his body, and I don't think that he's the only one like that. We're going to get to another guy that I think that happened to as well. But that happened to Moses. But there's another guy that had kind of a interesting death, if you will, or not a death at all, and that was Elijah. Elijah, in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, how did he pass from this world to the next? It says it came to pass as they went on. That was Elijah and Elisha. They're just walking along, talking, kind of like, if me and Paul were to go for a stroll through the park, would that be weird? That's not weird. If we go for a stroll together through the park and we're just talking, and all of a sudden a chariot made of fire comes and splits us up, and it comes through, and in a whirlwind, it takes Elijah up to heaven. So he didn't even really die, kind of like Enoch that was there, and then all of a sudden he wasn't there, for God took him. And so all of a sudden Paul, I'm assuming I would go in the chariot, right? And Paul would just be left behind, and he'd be like, man, what's going on? He would just see the whirlwind, and I'd be up there going, woohoo! Right? I'd be going. So that happened to Elijah. So Moses is buried in a special spot, right? Because I believe the Lord still had plans for his body. Elijah is just taken up. So neither one of them had what you might call a natural death. And then, of course, those things alone, you can't really build any kind of doctrine upon that. But when you go to Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 to 3, do you remember Jesus takes his disciples up to the top of the mountain, and he gives them a glimpse of his second coming. He gives them a glimpse of what he's going to look like when he comes in all of his glory. And who's with him? These two, right? These two guys, the two olive trees that stand before the Lord of all the earth. They are the anointed ones that stand before him, are standing right with him when he comes. And after 6 days, Jesus talked with Peter, James, and John, the top three. And he brings them up to a high mountain, and he's transfigured before them. And his face does shine as the sun. Again, there's the picture. Remember, that's always the way it describes Christ in Revelation. When he comes at his second coming, his face shined like the sun. His raiment was white as light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elijah talking with him. I think that when we put all this together, I think we can be pretty certain that the two witnesses are Moses and Elijah. These guys, it calls them not only two olive trees, but it says, these are my two candlesticks. Because they're witnesses. That's always what a candlestick represents, is you're supposed to you don't light a candle and then hide it under a bushel. You're supposed to let it shine so that everybody has light that's in the room. That's the reason why he gives that same imagery to the church, is because we are supposed to be witnesses, right? These are his two candlesticks. They are his witnesses to the nation of Israel. But not only that, but I think it's really interesting that in these two guys you see represented not only just witnesses, but specific witnesses. They represent the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. The law and the prophets. The law and the prophets. That's what they represent. The law is always intended to lead someone, according to Galatians. It is our schoolmaster that leads someone to Christ, right? That's what the law is supposed to do. And the prophets are always there to point someone to the return of Christ. And that's what these two preachers are going to do. They're going through the law. They're going to use the law to bring people to Christ and demonstrate and preach about the blood of Christ and why that is necessary, but also to preach about his imminent return. And that's what you always see that are supposed to be the witnesses to the nation of Israel, is the law of prophets. Let me show you what I mean. Look in Luke chapter 16, verses 28 through 29. And here you see a story about a man that goes to hell. This guy was a rich guy, and he had it made, man. He's just living it up, champagne and yachts all of his life, right? And he finally dies, and then he goes straight to hell, which is exactly where I'm sure most of his neighbors hoped that he would go. And so he goes straight to hell, and he's down there in torment. And he says to Abraham, he says, listen, can you just send Lazarus to put a little bit of water on my tongue? which I think, man, the audacity on this guy. I mean, Lazarus was poor all of his life, suffered all of his life. And even when he's in hell, he still wants Lazarus to serve him. Oh my gosh. I mean, you know, everybody in paradise was just like, oh, give me a break. Still, this guy doesn't get it, right? Anyway, he says, can you please? And he says, and Abraham says, I can't. There's a huge gulf fixed between us. I can't cross over to you. He says, well, do me this favor then. I want you to go to my brothers and I want you to tell them about this place. And what does Abraham say? He says, they have Moses and the prophets. They have the law and the prophets. That was always, okay, what was supposed to be the witness to the Jews is the law and the prophets. He says they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. Right? Let them hear them. That is who Moses and Elijah represent to the nation of Israel. They represent the law and the prophets. And he goes on, Abraham goes on to tell him, he says, because if they won't listen to the law and the prophets, then they won't believe even if someone rises from the dead. You have to believe the law and the prophets. They are not symbols. I'm not saying they're symbols. They're not. They're literal preachers, but they represent the law and the prophets who have come to preach the blood of Christ and the kingdom of Christ to Israel, and through them the remnant will be saved. Along with them, with all of their cohorts, the 144,000. They're going to be leading them to Christ, along with many Gentiles throughout many nations and tongues will also come to Christ during that time. But specifically the believing Israel. And after that will be the end. And that's exactly what you see that happens next in the chapter is the trumpet sounds in verse 14. It says, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe is coming quickly. The third woe is the last trumpet. And the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of the Lord, of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders, they're the representatives of the church in heaven before the throne. And they which sat before God on their seats, they fell on their faces and they worshiped God. So those in heaven are worshiping, saying, we give thanks, Lord God Almighty, because who art and was and are to come, because you have taken to thee great power and hast reigned. They're so thankful that finally Christ is going to reign. And the nations were angry. Now back on earth, the nations are angry because his wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, that thou shouldest give reward unto the prophets and his saints. Those are the prophets and saints from the tribulation. They're going to get some rewards. And them that fear thy name, small and great. And shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. And the temple of God is going to be open in heaven. And we're going to see the temple, the ark of his testament, and there will be lightnings and voices and thunders and an earthquake and great hail. Okay, so the final trump, when the final trump happens, here's some of the things that are going to happen, just straight from the passage. One, the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of the Lord. So that's one of the ways that we know that this is the end that it's talking about, right? And we've said that a lot as we go through here. This is one of the ways you know that this book is not chronological, because he's talking here about the end. Because it's in the end that Christ becomes the king and he reigns. Those in heaven, they start worshiping and praising. Why? Because he's now reigning. He's going to reign, finally. The nations will be judged, right? The preachers and the saints, these prophets and the 144,000, the people that have feared his name in tribulation are going to be rewarded. Those that destroy the earth are going to be destroyed. The temple in heaven are going to open, right? This doesn't happen in the middle of the story. This is what happens at the end of the story. And then there will come out lightning and voices and thundering and earthquakes and great hail. And this, it's just important to note of that last statement that kind of happens every time you see with the seventh seal, with the sixth seal, with the seventh trumpet, with the seventh vial. That happens every time. The voices, the thunderings, the lightning, the earthquake, and the great hail. This always happens. So this trump is going to be the final conclusion. So leading up, you're going to have the temple rebuilt. You're going to have these two witnesses with all their guys. The 144,000 are going to be the law and the prophets, going to be preaching in order to bring the nation of Israel back to Christ, right? And after they get done, the seventh trumpet is going to sound. Now, what can we learn from this? What can we take away from this today? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned to you before, is that you must remember that on the earth today, that we live in the dispensation that is called the age of grace. We live in the church age. And there's going to come a time when the church is taken out of here with the rapture, and that particular dispensation is going to end. And then you're going to go into a transitional period of the tribulation of 7 years before a new dispensation starts, which is the millennial kingdom. During that 7 years of tribulation, God is going to purify the nation of Israel and bring them back to him. And he will say that they are my people, and they will say, you are my God, you are my Lord and my God. And he's going to bring them into his kingdom. But right now, the age in which we live is called the age of grace. During the age of grace, he also has a temple, and he also has his witnesses, just like he will have during this time. Right now, during this age, you are the temple. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, where he says, know you not that ye are the temple of God, that you are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, and that you are the temple now. You are the place where people can come to God in order to be reconciled. Not only that, but you are his witnesses. In the time of tribulation, he will have Moses and Elijah, these guys that are specifically anointed as the ones that stand before the Lord, to come down and be his witnesses, and they are going to lead the 144,000 to share the gospel of the kingdom with the world. But in this particular dispensation, he's called us to do that. We are his witnesses. Now, we touched on that a little bit last time when we said that Christ revealed himself to the nation, and he's going to do that through his word, and we said that that's how he's going to do that today, is through us and through his word. So I don't want to necessarily rehash that again, but we do see kind of the same application to us, that there has to be a temple and a witness today, doesn't there? But I want to talk about something a little bit more specific. I want to talk about something a little bit more practical, okay? When we look at these two anointed ones, we can see something very practical, because when you pick out Elijah as an example, it tells us in James chapter 5, verse 17, don't turn there, just listen to me. James says, that Elijah, this guy, he was like an anointed one. He's the olive tree that stands before the Lord God of all the earth. He's pretty special. But James says that he was a guy just like us. He was a man of like passions, just like you and me. And he says that he prayed and closed up the heavens so that it would not rain. Now, this is when we talk about us being witnesses, we talk about us being the temple right now, and how it is that we're actually going to perform that role, how we're going to fulfill that particular function. There's one thing that we can look that's special about Elijah. Obviously, this man was a man of prayer. Maybe one of the great ways that you can be that witness today, maybe one of the ways that you can represent the temple of God today, is by being someone of prayer. That's one thing that we can take away from Elijah. If we want to take something from this and apply it to ourselves inspirationally today, maybe we should be a great man or lady of prayer. So much so that we could, figuratively speaking, stop the rain. Could you be that kind of a prayer warrior? Could you be that kind of a praying believer? That you could change things that would happen into not happening anymore because you pray. Now, that's something that all of us can do. We are, through our prayers, able to move the hand of God through our prayers. Not only can he change circumstances, but he can change people's hearts when we pray. And we can talk to them and we can preach. Now, obviously, they both represent the fact that we should be preaching the gospel. We get that, right? We need to be preaching the gospel. But I'm saying, added to that, shouldn't we be people of prayer like Elijah was? Because he's the one that can reach on the inside where we can't reach. Because we preach and it just bounces off, man. It just bounces off people, and they've got all their excuses and all the reasons why they don't want to believe. But what they can't stop are your prayers. Can you be a person of prayer today? That's one way that you can be just like Elijah. And not only that, but what about Moses? Moses also had a special ability. And it's not one that maybe you would think of, because he was a great preacher too. He was a prophet, the Bible calls him. He was a preacher just like Elijah, and represents the fact that we should be talking. And I'm a big believer that we are not to be silent Christians. We need to speak up. We need to preach. But did you know that Moses also was one of the most prolific writers in the Old Testament? He's the one that wrote the Pentateuch. Think about how much of the Old Testament that Moses wrote. For a guy that said that he wasn't a very good communicator, he ended up being a tremendous author and wrote the majority, or all of the Pentateuch. Maybe you can take something from Moses. Maybe you think, well, I'm not such a great communicator. Well, maybe there's a different way you can communicate. I think you should be telling your friends and stuff, but what if you become a great writer instead? If there's one thing that Baptists today do not have, it's writers. Baptists, look at us historically. We don't write. We don't write books. We Baptists who believe the Bible, who teach proper doctrine, we need writers. Because, man, I can preach a sermon and people say, well, maybe that was kind of good. No, I thought that kind of sucked. But they say that, they go home and they eat their dinner and then they forget it. But if you write a book, now that is forever. Books stick around. Books, they last a long time. And they can be used not only by you, but they can be used by other people to continue on. We are still enjoying all of the great books that Charles Spurgeon wrote to this day, even long after he's dead. What if you become a great writer? Maybe there's another unique way that you can communicate on top of your speaking. Maybe there's another way. I'm saying you should look at how God might be able to use you, not only in your prayers, but in your particular abilities in order to communicate the gospel. How might he use you to do that? That's one thing that we can take away from both Moses and Elijah, that he could use us in special ways, in the private ways, but also in the public. How do you think that God might use you today? Because there is coming a time when we will be out of here, that just like Moses and Elijah, we're going to have a remarkable departure as well, aren't we? But until that day comes, how might God use you in order to preach to those who don't know Christ?